The pregnant woman fainted at the mansion's entrance, and the millionaire decided to take her and the baby in. The security camera footage would later show that she held onto the ornate iron gate for exactly 47 seconds before her knees buckled. Madison Carter hadn't eaten in 2 days, and her pregnant body simply couldn't take it anymore. As she collapsed onto the cobblestone driveway of 2241 Belmont Avenue, her last conscious thought was of the baby growing inside her and how she had failed them both. Alexander Reed was reviewing quarterly reports in his home office when the alarm notification flashed across his tablet. He rarely checked the security feeds personally. That's what he paid his security team for. But something made him tap the alert. The sight of a young woman crumpled by his front gate sent him running down 3 flights of stairs, his Italian leather shoes echoing through the empty halls of his Newport, Rhode Island mansion. "Gerald!" he shouted for his head of security while rushing through the front door. "Call an ambulance." The autumn air bit at his face as he sprinted down the curved driveway. As he approached, he could see she was breathing, though barely. Her dark hair was tangled across her face, and her worn backpack had spilled open, revealing everything she owned. A few pieces of clothing, a dog-eared paperback, and a small ultrasound photo that had fluttered onto the ground beside her. Alexander picked up the sonogram, his chest tightening at the sight of the tiny form captured in black and white. He'd seen one just like it 8 years ago, before everything fell apart, before Rachel's pregnancy had ended in tragedy, before their marriage had crumbled under the weight of their grief. The woman stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open. They were a startling shade of green, clouded with confusion and fear. "You're safe," Alexander said softly, kneeling beside her. "Help is on the way." "My baby," she whispered, her hand moving protectively to her swollen belly. "Your baby's going to be fine," he assured her, though he had no way of knowing if that was true. "Can you tell me your name?" "Madison," she managed, before her eyes rolled back and she lost consciousness again. The ambulance arrived 6 minutes later, its lights painting the traditional New England architecture in alternating red and white. As the paramedics worked, Alexander found himself unable to step away. He answered their questions about what he'd witnessed, handed them the ultrasound photo, and then, surprising himself, climbed into the ambulance alongside her. "Sir," one of the paramedics began, "unless you're family." "I'm all she is right now," Alexander said firmly, his tone carrying the authority of someone used to getting his way. In truth, he had no idea if Madison had family, friends, or a support system. But something about her desperate arrival at his gate, about the worn backpack and the solitary ultrasound photo, told him she was alone, just like he had been, all those years ago. At Newport Hospital, Alexander paced the waiting room while Madison underwent examination. His assistant had already called to reschedule his afternoon meetings, and his mind raced with questions. What had driven a pregnant woman to the point of collapse? Why had she chosen his gate to hold on to in her final conscious moments? 2 hours later, Dr. Patricia Chun emerged from the examination room. "Mr. Reed, she's stable now. Severe dehydration and malnourishment, but we're treating that. The baby's heartbeat is strong. She's about 7 months along." "She?" Alexander asked. Dr. Chun nodded. "It's a girl. Madison's asking for you." Alexander followed the doctor down the sterile hospital corridor, his mind flashing back to another hospital, another time. He'd made this walk before, but that time had ended in devastating news and Rachel's broken sobs. Madison was sitting up in bed now, and 4 dripping fluids into her arm. The hospital gown made her look even younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps 25 at most. Her face had regained some color, but her eyes held a wariness that spoke of hard lessons learned too young. "Thank you," she said quietly. "The doctor said you brought me here. Anyone would have done the same." Alexander pulled a chair closer to her bed. "Madison, I don't mean to pry, but are there people we should contact? Family? The baby's father?" She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "There's no one. I've been trying to find work, but no one wants to hire a pregnant woman who's living in her car. I saw your gate and I couldn't walk anymore. I'm sorry for causing trouble." Alexander thought of his empty mansion, of the nursery he'd never had the heart to dismantle, of the promise he'd made to Rachel years ago about never giving up on the dream of family. "You haven't caused any trouble," he said. "And if you're willing to trust a stranger, I have a proposition for you." Madison tensed slightly, and he quickly continued. "I have more space than I know what to do with, and my staff includes an excellent on-call physician. Stay, at least until the baby comes. Give yourself a chance to get back on your feet." "Why?" Madison asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why would you help me?" Alexander looked down at his hands, remembering how empty they had felt 8 years ago. "Because sometimes people need a safe harbor in a store, and sometimes those offering shelter need it just as much as those seeking it." As Madison processed his words, a small kick from her daughter made her smile for the first time since she'd awakened. Perhaps, she thought, this was what hope felt like. The guest room in the east wing of Alexander Reed's mansion was larger than any apartment Madison had ever lived in. As she stood in the doorway, her small backpack clutched to her chest, the enormity of her situation finally hit her. 24 hours ago, she had been sleeping in her rusted Honda Civic. Now she was standing on marble floors, surrounded by antique furniture that probably cost more than she'd earn in a lifetime. "Mrs. Sullivan has prepared this room for you," Alexander said, gesturing to the elegant space. "She's been my housekeeper for 15 years. You'll meet her in the morning. She's already gone home for the evening." Madison stepped inside, her fingers trailing over the soft fabric of a reading chair by the window. The view overlooked manicured gardens that seemed to stretch endlessly into the twilight. "Mr. Reed, Alexander," he corrected gently. "And before you try to refuse this again, remember what Dr. Chun said about bed rest." The hospital discharge had come with strict instructions: 2 weeks of minimal activity to ensure both mother and baby recovered fully from the severe dehydration. Madison had protested accepting Alexander's offer, but her options were non-existent, and her daughter's kicks had become a constant reminder of her responsibility to someone other than herself. "I'll pay you back," she said firmly, turning to face him. "Once I can work again. Let's focus on your recovery first." Alexander's voice was kind, but brooked no argument. "The kitchen is fully stocked, and Mrs. Sullivan will bring breakfast at 8. My office is on the 2nd floor if you need anything." He paused, seeming to debate his next words. "I know it's strange, being in a stranger's home, but you're safe here, Madison." After he left, Madison explored her new temporary sanctuary. The in-suite bathroom featured a deep soaking tub that made her almost cry with longing. She hadn't had a proper bath in months. The walk-in closet was empty except for a plush robe and a new set of pajamas, still with tags attached, in exactly her size. As she changed into the soft cotton pajamas, Madison caught her reflection in the full-length mirror. Her dark hair hung limp around her face, and her eyes carried shadows that spoke of more than just physical exhaustion. At 26, she felt decades older than her years. "We're okay," she whispered to her bump, a habit she developed over the lonely months. "We're going to be okay." Later that night, unable to sleep despite the cloud-like comfort of the bed, Madison made her way to the kitchen. The mansion was eerily quiet, moonlight streaming through tall windows and casting shadows across expensive artwork. She found the kitchen easily enough. It was industrial grade, clearly designed for catering large events, though a smaller breakfast nook suggested more intimate daily use. She was pouring herself a glass of milk when a voice behind her made her jump. "Couldn't sleep either?" Alexander stood in the doorway, his usual polished appearance softened by casual clothes and slightly disheveled hair. He looked younger somehow, more approachable. "The baby likes midnight snacks," Madison explained, one hand resting on her stomach. He smiled, but there was a flash of something in his eyes. Pain, maybe, or memory. "Mind if I join you?" They settled in the breakfast nook, Madison with her milk and the peanut butter sandwich she'd made, Alexander with a cup of tea. The silence should have been awkward, but somehow wasn't. "Can I ask you something?" Madison finally said, gathering her courage. "Why did you really let me stay? And don't say it's just because you have the space." Alexander stared into his tea for a long moment. 8 years ago, my wife Rachel was pregnant," he said quietly. "We've been trying for years, and finally, everything was perfect. Until it wasn't. We lost the baby in the 7th month. Rachel couldn't." We couldn't move past it. She left a year later. Madison's heart ached for the grief in his voice. I'm so sorry. When I saw you at the gate, he paused, collecting his thoughts. Sometimes life gives you a chance to help someone else avoid the pain you couldn't prevent in your own life. I'm not trying to replace what I lost, Madison. I couldn't walk away. My boyfriend walked away, Madison found herself saying. When I told him about the baby, said he wasn't ready, wasn't sure I was even telling the truth about it being his. I had a job at a restaurant then, but morning sickness was so bad. They couldn't keep someone who had to run to the bathroom every hour. His loss, Alexander said firmly, both the restaurants and the boyfriends. Madison smiled despite herself. That's a nice way of looking at it. I've learned that perspective is everything. Alexander stood, rinsing his cup in the sink. Try to get some sleep, Madison. Mrs. Sullivan's breakfasts are legendary. You'll want to be well rested for that. As Madison lay in bed later, feeling her daughter's gentle movements, she thought about perspective. Maybe this wasn't just about having a place to stay. Maybe, somehow, this was about healing, not just for her, but for Alexander too. She fell asleep thinking about second chances, and for the first time in months, her dreams weren't filled with fear. Mrs. Sullivan turned out to be a force of nature packed into a petite frame. Within days of Madison's arrival, the housekeeper had transformed the guest room into something that felt like home, appearing with maternity clothes that just happened to be lying around and pregnancy pillows that made sleeping infinitely more comfortable. Just a bit of mint tea, dear, she said one morning, setting down a steaming cup beside Madison's breakfast plate. Helps with the morning queasiness, though I suppose you're past the worst of that now. Madison smiled gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. After a week in the mansion, she'd learned that arguing with Mrs. Sullivan's maternal instincts was futile. The older woman reminded her of her own grandmother, who'd passed away when Madison was in high school, the last real family she'd had. Mr. Reed asked me to let you know he'll be working from home today, Mrs. Sullivan continued, adjusting the fresh flowers she placed on the breakfast table. He has some important calls, but he'd like to speak with you when you have a moment. Madison's stomach tightened with anxiety. She'd been waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Alexander to realize that housing a pregnant stranger was madness. She forced herself to finish her breakfast, each bite tasting like cardboard despite Mrs. Sullivan's excellent cooking. She found Alexander in his office later that morning, his attention focused on multiple monitors displaying what looked like complex financial data. He glanced up when she knocked on the open door, his face breaking into a warm smile that eased some of her tension. Madison, come in. How are you feeling? Better, she said, settling into one of the leather chairs across from his desk. The doctor says the baby's measurements are all back to normal. Excellent news. Alexander closed his laptop, giving her his full attention. I wanted to talk to you about something. I have a proposition, a real one this time, not just emergency housing. Madison's hands instinctively went to her stomach, a protective gesture that hadn't gone unnoticed by Alexander over the past week. I run a charitable foundation, he continued, alongside my investment firm. We focus on education and career development, particularly for people who've faced unexpected life challenges. We have an opening for an administrative assistant, and I think you'd be perfect for it. Madison blinked, struggling to process his words. But I'm pregnant. Yes, and in about 2 months you'll need maternity leave, which is fully paid. Alexander leaned forward, his expression earnest. Madison, I've seen how you organize your room, how you help Mrs. Sullivan with her scheduling. You have natural talent for administration, and more importantly, you have empathy. That's exactly what we need in someone working with grant applicants. I don't have a college degree, she said quietly, voicing her biggest insecurity. She dropped out in her second year when her grandmother's medical bills had become overwhelming. Neither did my first COO. She started as my assistant 20 years ago. Alexander handed her a folder. This contains information about the position, including salary and benefits. The foundation has an on-site daycare center for employees' children. Take some time to think about it. Madison opened the folder, and her eyes widened at the salary figure. It was more than double what she'd made at her best-paying job. Why? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Why do all this for me? Alexander was quiet for a moment, his fingers absently touching a framed photo on his desk that Madison couldn't quite see. "Do you know what I've learned in business, Madison? That sometimes the best investments are the ones everyone else overlooks. I'm not offering you charity. I'm offering you an opportunity. What you do with it is entirely up to you." A memory flashed through Madison's mind, her grandmother's voice saying, "Sometimes blessings come disguised as challenges, sweet pea. The trick is being brave enough to recognize them." "When?" She cleared her throat, fighting back tears. "When would you want me to start?" Alexander's smile reached his eyes. "The position is yours whenever you're ready, though I'd suggest waiting until Dr. Chan clears you for regular activity." Later that afternoon, Madison sat in the garden, watching butterflies dance among late-blooming flowers. Her hand rested on her stomach, feeling her daughter's increasingly strong movements. For the first time since discovering her pregnancy, she allowed herself to imagine a future, a real one, with stability and purpose. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She opened it to find a photo of a tiny knitted baby hat in pale yellow, accompanied by Mrs. Sullivan's message. "Found this in my crafting drawer. Thought little miss might like it. Dinner's at 6, dear." Madison touched the screen, her vision blurring with tears that, for once, weren't from fear or despair. Her daughter gave a particularly strong kick, as if adding her own approval to the day's developments. "I know, baby girl," Madison whispered, looking up at the mansion that somehow, improbably, was starting to feel like home. "I know exactly how you feel." The Reed Foundation occupied the entire 5th floor of a gleaming office building in downtown Newport. Madison's heels clicked against the marble floor as she followed Alexander through the glass doors, trying to project a confidence she didn't quite feel. At 8 months pregnant, wearing a maternity suit Mrs. Sullivan had helped her choose, she felt like an imposter in this world of polished professionals. "Ready to meet the team?" Alexander asked, pausing by a set of double doors. Madison nodded, smoothing her jacket. In the 3 weeks since accepting the position, she'd studied everything she could about the Foundation's work. The reality of what they did, changing lives through education and opportunity, made her even more determined to prove herself worthy of this chance. The conference room fell silent as they entered. 8 faces turned toward them, curiosity evident in their expressions. Madison recognized some of them from her research: Natalie Porter, the COO who'd started as an assistant; Ryan Sheehan, head of grant programs; Maria Delgado, community outreach director. "Everyone," Alexander began. "This is Madison Carter, our new administrative assistant. As you know, we've been understaffed since Christina's promotion, and Madison's background makes her uniquely qualified to understand our applicants' needs." Madison felt a rush of gratitude at his careful wording. He hadn't lied. Her background did give her insight into the struggles their grant recipients faced, but he presented it as an asset rather than a liability. The morning passed in a blur of introductions, systems training, and information overload. By lunch, Madison's head was spinning, but in a good way. She was reviewing grant application procedures with Ryan when a familiar flutter in her stomach turned into a sharp kick. Ryan noticed her slight wince. "You okay?" "Yes, sorry. She's just very active today." Madison rubbed her side, smiling apologetically. "I remember those days," Ryan said, pulling out his phone to show her a photo of twin toddlers. "These two used to tag team their kicks. My husband thought it was hilarious until he had to deal with my 3 a.m. ice cream cravings." The casual mention of his family, the easy acceptance in his tone, helped Madison relax further. Throughout the day, she discovered that many of her co-workers had similar stories, of struggles overcome, of unexpected paths that led them here. At 5 o'clock, Madison was gathering her things when Natalie appeared at her desk. "How was your first day?" the COO asked, perching on the edge of Madison's desk with the ease of someone who'd earned her authority rather than inherited it. "Overwhelming," Madison admitted, "but in the best way possible." Natalie's smile was knowing. 20 years ago, I was 9 months pregnant and living in a shelter when Alexander offered me a job. Everyone thought he was crazy, including me. She stood, straightening her designer suit. Nobody told me back then that sometimes the people who understand the value of an opportunity best are the ones who've never had one before. Madison watched Natalie walk away, her words echoing in her mind. The baby kicked again, gentler this time, as if sensing her mother's thoughtful mood. The drive back to the mansion was quiet, with Alexander focused on some papers and Madison lost in reflection. It wasn't until they pulled through the gates that he spoke. "You did well today," he said simply. "Thank you." Madison hesitated, then added, "Not just for today, for everything." Alexander's response was interrupted by Mrs. Sullivan, hurrying down the front steps, her face concerned. "Mr. Reed, there's someone here to see Madison. He's been waiting for an hour. Says he's the baby's father." Madison felt the blood drain from her face. Through the gathering dusk, she could see a familiar figure pacing near the front door. Brandon Miller, the man who told her to deal with it when she'd announced her pregnancy. "Do you want to see him?" Alexander asked quietly, his tone making it clear that she had a choice. Madison took a deep breath, remembering the strength she'd felt in the Foundation's offices, the acceptance she'd found in this unlikely sanctuary. She thought of Natalie's words about understanding the value of opportunities. "Yes," she said firmly, "I need to do this. For her." She touched her stomach, feeling her daughter move beneath her hand. "And for me." Alexander nodded, but his expression was protective as they approached the front door. "We'll be right inside if you need us," he said, guiding Mrs. Sullivan into the house despite the housekeeper's obvious reluctance to leave Madison alone. Brandon straightened as Madison approached, his familiar features twisted with an emotion she couldn't quite read. 8 months ago, seeing him had made her heart race. Now, she felt something entirely different, not anger or fear, but a calm certainty that she'd grown beyond the girl who had needed his approval. "Madison," he started, taking a step forward, "we need to talk." Standing in the growing darkness, one hand resting protectively on her unborn daughter, Madison squared her shoulders. She was no longer the desperate woman who had collapsed at these gates. She was someone new, someone stronger. "Yes," she agreed, her voice steady. "We do." "You look different," Brandon said, his eyes traveling from Madison's polished appearance to the mansion behind her. His leather jacket was the same one he'd worn when they'd first met at the diner where she'd waitressed, but somehow he seemed smaller now, less intimidating. "A lot has changed." Madison kept her voice neutral, remembering the breathing exercises Mrs. Sullivan had taught her for managing stress. "Why are you here, Brandon?" He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture she'd once found charming. "My mom saw you today, coming out of the Reed Foundation building. She said you looked pregnant." He paused, struggling with his next words. "I've been doing some thinking. About us, about everything." "There is no us," Madison said firmly. "You made that clear when you blocked my number and told your friends I was lying about the baby. I was scared, okay?" Brandon stepped closer, his cologne, once intoxicating to her, now making her slightly nauseated. "I'm ready now. We can make this work. My cousin has an apartment in Providence. Says we can stay there until—" "No." The word came out stronger than Madison had intended, but she didn't regret it. "This isn't about you being ready. This is about you seeing me working at a prestigious foundation and suddenly deciding I'm worth your time again." Brandon's expression darkened. "So what, you're too good for me now? Living in some rich guy's mansion, playing dress-up in fancy clothes?" "Mr. Reed offered me help when I had nothing," Madison said, her hand protectively cradling her bump as their daughter stirred restlessly. "He gave me a job based on my abilities, not my circumstances. He believed in me when you wouldn't even answer my calls." "Oh, I bet he did," Brandon sneered. "Single, rich guy takes in pregnant homeless woman? Come on, Madison. What's really going on here?" The accusation hung in the air like poison. Madison felt a surge of anger, not just for herself, but for Alexander, who had shown her nothing but respect and kindness. "You don't get to do this," she said, her voice shaking with controlled fury. "You don't get to abandon me, ignore me for months, and then show up making accusations and demands. This baby, your daughter, deserved better than that." "I deserved better." "Daughter?" Brandon's voice cracked slightly. "It's a girl?" "Yes, and she's healthy and strong, and due in 4 weeks." Madison took a deep breath. You have a choice to make, Brandon. If you want to be part of her life, we can work out a legal arrangement through proper channels. But if this is just about your ego, about seeing me doing well without you, then you need to leave. Inside the mansion, she could see shadows moving behind the curtains. Alexander and Mrs. Sullivan, no doubt watching protectively. The knowledge of their presence gave her strength. Brandon was quiet for a long moment, looking past her at the magnificent house, then down at her stomach where his daughter grew. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, smaller, more honest. I really messed up, didn't I? Yes, Madison said simply. You did. He nodded slowly, shoving his hands in his pockets. I'll have my lawyer contact you. About visitation, child support, whatever you think is fair. I can't promise I'll be perfect, but I want to try. For her. Okay. Madison felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Not everything was resolved, but at least now there was clarity. You can reach me through the foundation's office. As Brandon walked back to his car, shoulders slumped, Madison felt her daughter kick particularly hard. Despite the emotional exhaustion of the confrontation, she smiled. I know, baby girl, she whispered. We're both stronger than we thought. The front door opened behind her, and she heard familiar footsteps on the gravel. Everything all right? Alexander asked quietly, coming to stand beside her. Madison watched Brandon's taillights disappear down the long driveway. Yes, she said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. Everything is exactly as it should be. Mrs. Sullivan appeared with a cup of her special chamomile tea, clucking worriedly about Madison needing to rest. As they went inside, Madison caught Alexander watching her with an expression of pride that brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Later that night, unable to sleep, Madison wandered to the kitchen for her now routine midnight snack. She found Alexander already there, 2 bowls of ice cream waiting on the counter. Rough days call for rocky road, he said, sliding 1 bowl toward her. Thank you, she said, and they both knew she meant more than just the ice cream. They ate in comfortable silence, the mansion quiet around them. Through the kitchen window, the moon cast a gentle light on the garden where, just months ago, Madison had first begun to believe in second chances. He's going to try to be involved, she finally said. Brandon, I mean. Alexander nodded thoughtfully. And how do you feel about that? Honestly, Madison spooned up the last bit of ice cream. I feel ready. Whatever happens, I know I can handle it. I'm not the same person who collapsed at your gate. No, Alexander agreed softly. You're much stronger than that person. You always were. You just needed a safe place to remember it. The contractions started during a foundation board meeting. Madison had been taking notes on donor contributions when the first wave hit, sharp enough to make her grip the edge of her chair. She managed to maintain her composure, years of hiding discomfort serving her well, but Alexander's watchful eyes caught her subtle wince. He was at her side before she could protest. Meeting adjourned, he announced to the room of startled board members. We'll reconvene next week. I'm fine, Madison insisted, even as another contraction gripped her. They're probably just Braxton Hicks. They're 3 minutes apart. Natalie interrupted, checking her watch. I've been timing them since you first started shifting in your chair. Trust me, after 3 kids, you develop a 6th sense for these things. The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Mrs. Sullivan appeared as if by magic with Madison's pre-packed hospital bag. Ryan's husband, a labor and delivery nurse at Newport Hospital, called ahead to alert the staff. And through it all, Alexander remained a steady presence at her side, his calm voice anchoring her through increasingly intense contractions. Have you called Brandon? Alexander asked as they pulled up to the hospital entrance. Madison nodded, breathing through another contraction. Left a message. His mom said, he's at a job site in Boston. Should be here in a few hours. The delivery suite was exactly like the one they toured 2 weeks ago, but somehow everything felt different now that it was real. As nurses hooked up monitors and checked her progress, Madison found herself gripped by a sudden, overwhelming fear. I can't do this, she whispered, tears streaming down her chin announced it was time to push. Madison had never felt more exhausted or more determined in her life. You've got this, Brandon said from one side. "We're all right here," Alexander assured her from the other. With Mrs. Sullivan's encouragement, Natalie's experience coaching, and what felt like the last reserves of her strength, Madison brought her daughter into the world at 7:42 p.m. The sound of that first cry broke something open inside her chest, releasing a flood of emotions she hadn't known she was capable of feeling. "Would you like to cut the cord?" Dr. Chun asked Brandon, who looked both terrified and awestruck as he nodded. When they placed the baby on Madison's chest, tiny and perfect and completely real, time seemed to stop. Her daughter had Brandon's dark hair and Madison's green eyes, already alert and studying the world with what looked like serious contemplation. "Hello, Charlotte Rose," Madison whispered, the name she'd chosen months ago finally belonging to this small, miraculous person. "We've been waiting for you." Brandon touched their daughter's tiny hand with one trembling finger. "She's beautiful," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for not giving up." Alexander had moved to the corner, giving the new family their space, but Madison called him over. "Would you like to hold your goddaughter?" His eyes widened in surprise. "Goddaughter? If you want," Madison said softly. "You gave us both a chance at a new life. I'd like Charlotte to always have you in hers." As Alexander carefully cradled Charlotte, Mrs. Sullivan dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, Madison saw her daughter's future unfold before her. Not perfect, perhaps, but rich with love and possibility. She had created not just a baby, but a family, albeit an unconventional one. "Welcome to the world, little one," Alexander murmured to Charlotte. "You have your mother's strength. You're going to do amazing things." Outside the window, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Madison thought about another night, not so long ago, when she'd held onto an iron gate with the last of her strength. She hadn't known then that she wasn't just holding onto a gate, but onto hope itself. Charlotte's tiny hand wrapped around her finger, and Madison smiled through her tears. Sometimes the greatest journeys began with a single moment of courage, or a single act of kindness. She had experienced both, and her life would never be the same. 6 months passed like a dream, marked by Charlotte's milestones in the gradual settling into new routines. Madison had mastered the art of typing one-handed while holding a sleeping baby, and her office at the Reed Foundation had acquired a subtle collection of baby items. A portable crib in the corner, a shelf of board books, tiny socks that somehow kept appearing in random drawers. The Foundation's daycare center had become Charlotte's second home, though she spent more time being passed around the office than in her designated spot. Ryan's twins had appointed themselves her official protectors, and Natalie's teenage daughter often babysat on the rare evenings Madison needed time to herself. Brandon had surprised everyone, including himself, with his dedication to fatherhood. He'd taken a construction management position in Newport to be closer, showing up reliably for his designated days and never missing a pediatrician appointment. While things between him and Madison remained strictly cordial, they'd found a comfortable rhythm in co-parenting. It was a warm spring morning when Madison arrived at work to find Alexander in an unusually contemplative mood. He was standing by the window in his office, staring out at the harbor. "Everything okay?" she asked, adjusting Charlotte in her carrier. The baby was awake but quiet, contentedly chewing on her favorite teething toy. "Rachel called last night," Alexander said, turning to face her. His ex-wife's name no longer carried the weight of grief it once had. "She's getting married again. She's pregnant." Madison felt her heart catch. "How are you feeling about that?" "That's the thing," he said, moving to crouch in front of Charlotte, who immediately reached for his tie with pudgy fingers. "I feel happy for her, and I realized something. I'm not holding on to the past anymore. Haven't been for a while, actually." He looked up at Madison, his eyes clear and certain. "I've been thinking about the nursery upstairs, the one I could never bring myself to change. I think it's time." Madison understood the significance of what he was saying. That room had been a shrine to his loss for 8 years, untouched and unmentioned. "Are you sure?" "Charlotte needs a proper room here," he said simply, "for the nights you both stay over. And I." He hesitated, then continued, "I need to make space for new memories." Later that afternoon, they stood in the doorway of the nursery together. The room had been frozen in time. Soft yellow walls, white furniture, stuffed animals still arranged expectantly in a corner. Charlotte, secured in her carrier on Madison's chest, babbled happily, unaware of the emotional weight of the moment. "Where do we start?" Madison asked gently. Alexander took a deep breath. "Rachel's sister has a baby girl. I thought, maybe we could pack up these things, send them to her, let them be loved by another child." They worked through the afternoon, carefully wrapping each item. Alexander had a story for everything: the rocking chair he'd restored himself, the handmade quilt from Rachel's grandmother, the collection of classic children's books. As they packed, he shared these memories not with grief, but with a kind of peaceful acceptance. Mrs. Sullivan appeared periodically with refreshments and quiet support, taking Charlotte for brief periods when they needed both hands free. By sunset, the room was empty except for the rocking chair, which Alexander had decided to keep. "It's strange," he said, running his hand along the smooth wood. "I thought this would feel like letting go of my daughter, but instead, it feels like making room for her memory to breathe, to exist without weighing so heavily." Madison touched his arm gently. "She'll always be part of who you are, just like Charlotte will always be part of who I am, even though she's nothing like I imagined when I first found out I was pregnant." Charlotte chose that moment to let out a happy squeal, reaching toward Alexander with imperious demand. He took her automatically, and she immediately snuggled into his shoulder, her favorite sleeping position. "I have some ideas," Madison said, looking around the empty room, "for updating this space. If you like to hear them." Alexander smiled, swaying slightly as Charlotte's eyes began to drift closed. "I'd like that very much." They stayed there until the room grew dark, talking quietly about paint colors and furniture arrangements, about the future and healing and the unexpected ways life could surprise you. Through the window, the first stars appeared, just as they had the night Charlotte was born. Mrs. Sullivan found them there an hour later, Charlotte sound asleep on Alexander's shoulder, Madison sketching nursery designs on her tablet. The housekeeper took in the scene with knowing eyes, a small smile playing at her lips as she announced dinner was ready. As they walked downstairs, Madison caught a glimpse of their reflection in a hallway mirror. Alexander carrying Charlotte, she walking beside them, Mrs. Sullivan following with her usual protective air. They looked, she realized with a start, like a family. Not the family she'd imagined when she dreamed of motherhood, perhaps, but something equally precious, born of chance and choice and the courage to believe in new beginnings. 1 year to the day after Madison collapsed at the gates of the Reed mansion, she stood in the same spot, watching Charlotte take wobbly steps on the cobblestones. Her daughter's dark curls bounced with each determined stride, tiny hands reaching out for balance as she navigated between Madison and Alexander, who knelt a few feet away with encouraging words. The foundation's annual charity gala was in full swing behind them, the mansion's windows glowing with warmth and music. Madison had just finished giving her first public speech as the newly promoted director of applicant relations, sharing her story with donors and grant recipients alike. The standing ovation had brought tears to her eyes, but it was the proud expressions on Alexander's and Mrs. Sullivan's faces that had meant the most. "She's getting faster," Alexander observed as Charlotte successfully completed another journey between them. "Soon she'll be running the foundation herself. Already has her mother's determination," Brandon added, approaching from the driveway. He'd attended the gala's first hour to support Madison's speech before heading to his night shift at the construction site. Their co-parenting relationship had evolved into something neither of them had expected, a friendship built on mutual respect and their daughter's happiness. Charlotte spotted her father and changed course, prompting all three adults to move quickly to prevent a tumble. She reached Brandon's legs with a triumphant giggle, accepting his goodbye kisses and waves with the serene confidence of a child who knew she was loved abundantly. As Brandon's truck disappeared down the driveway, Madison felt a familiar wave of gratitude. A year ago, she thought she had nothing. Now she had everything. A career she was passionate about, a daughter who amazed her daily, and a family that defied conventional definitions but worked perfectly for them. "Penny for your thoughts?" Alexander asked, scooping up Charlotte as she began to show signs of tiredness. "I was just thinking about that night," Madison said, touching the iron gate. How terrified I was. How certain that I'd failed at everything. And now? Now I know that sometimes rock bottom is actually a foundation. She smiled, watching Charlotte's eyes grow heavy on Alexander's shoulder. Everything I've built since then, everything we've built, started right here.